May 16, 1940. The French officers gradually surrendered their weapons. Some attempted to flee quickly down the road toward the south. I occupied myself for a short while with the prisoners. Several officers among them approached me with different requests, including permission to keep their batmen and to retrieve personal kits from Philippeville, where they had previously been stationed. I found it particularly noteworthy that the Philippeville garrison intended to surrender rapidly and without resistance, so I approved the requests. My escorting panzer company then moved toward Neuville, about 2 miles south of Philippeville, with the aim of cutting off French forces retreating from Philippeville toward the south. Upon reaching the company commander, Most, I discovered that fighting had already begun near Neuville. The battle was moving southward and threatened to turn into a pursuit, but I did not wish to push farther in that direction. I therefore ordered the battalion to break contact and continue eastward from Neuville. Around 500 yards south of Vosséde, we encountered part of Panzer Company Huttmann, which joined us there. On the southern edge of Vosséde, we fought briefly with a substantial group of French tanks, though the engagement quickly turned in our favor. The French crews ceased firing and emerged from their tanks one after another. Roughly 15 French tanks fell into our hands, some damaged and others completely intact. Since it was impossible to leave guards behind, the undamaged tanks accompanied our column with their French drivers still inside. About 15 minutes later, we reached the main Dinant-Philippeville road, where I met the leading elements of the Rifle Brigade together with the 8th Machine Gun Battalion. They had become heavily engaged in the tank battle. I took several officers into my armored command vehicle and, with the entire column following, drove at high speed along the dusty road through the northern outskirts of Philippeville. Rommel had already turned around and was moving westward again. During the drive, I explained the situation to the commanding officers and assigned them their tasks. At our speed, roughly 40 miles an hour, the cloud of dust behind us was immense. Near Senzay, about 4 miles west of Philippeville, we encountered a body of fully armed French motorcyclists traveling in the opposite direction and picked them up as they passed. Most of them were so shocked to suddenly find themselves inside a German column that they abandoned their motorcycles in the ditch and offered no resistance. Without stopping, we pushed rapidly toward the hills west of Serfontaine, where reconnaissance had reported the leading units of the Panzer Regiment. Once we arrived, the column deployed as quickly as possible and, without halting, occupied the surrounding district. Looking back eastward from the hilltop after nightfall, one could see fires stretching across the horizon, proof that the 7th Panzer Division's advance into conquered territory had begun. The enemy's ability to infiltrate between the Panzer Regiment and Rifle Brigade during the afternoon had mainly been caused by the latter's delay in moving. Officers of a Panzer Division had to think and act independently within the broad framework of the overall plan, rather than wait for detailed orders. Every unit needed to know the objective, and each subordinate formation had to understand its role at all times. Early the next morning, 16th of May 1940, I received orders from Corps to remain at divisional headquarters, though no explanation was given. Around 9:30, I finally obtained permission from Corps to move forward again. Shortly afterward, the division received instructions to push through the Maginot Line and advance toward the hills near Avesnes. This was not the principal Maginot Line itself, which ended near Longuyon, but rather its western extension, where the fortifications were considerably weaker. German reports of the campaign often failed to distinguish between the original line and this extension. Guderian's and Reinhardt's corps had already crossed the Meuse, broken through the extension of the Maginot Line, and were racing westward behind it. Hoth's corps, after crossing the river farther north in Belgian territory, had likewise penetrated the line and was driving southwestward. Stury lay 12 miles west of Serfontaine, while Avesnes stood 12 miles west of Civry. I had already discussed our attack on the Maginot Line with my chief of staff when Army Commander Colonel General von Kluge arrived unexpectedly. He was surprised that the division had not yet moved. I outlined our plan to him. The intention was first to seize the high ground near Civry, while the reconnaissance battalion examined the Maginot positions across a broad front and the artillery massed around Sivry. Then, the Panzer Regiment, protected by concentrated artillery fire, would advance in extended order toward the French fortifications. Finally, the Rifle Brigade, supported by tanks, would capture the fortifications and remove roadblocks. Only after this was accomplished would the breakthrough toward Aves begin, with the armored units leading and the rest of the division following close behind. General von Kluge approved the plan completely. Soon, the leading battalion moved rapidly towards Sivry and entered the town without opposition. Artillery and anti-aircraft guns deployed immediately and were ordered to open fire into selected sectors of the frontier line in order to test whether the French would respond. Meanwhile, the 25th Panzer Regiment reached Sivry and received orders to cross the border and capture Clairfates, 3 miles farther on. No French batteries answered our bombardment. I traveled in the regimental commander's tank as on the previous day. Before long, we had crossed the frontier and the tanks rolled steadily in column toward Clairfates, which lay about a mile ahead. A reconnaissance report soon arrived stating that the road through the village had been mined. We therefore swung southward and advanced across open farmland and hedgerows in a semicircle around the village. There was still no sound from the enemy, although our artillery shells continued to fall at intervals deep inside French territory. Soon we entered orchards and dense hedges that slowed the advance. Rothenberg's tank was among the leading vehicles, with Heinke, my aide-de-camp, following in a Panzer IV. Heinke had orders to fire immediately whenever he received a signal from me, and thereby serve as the lead gun for the rest of the formation. Earlier fighting had shown repeatedly that too much time often passed before tank crews opened fire on fleeting targets. Suddenly, the sharp outline of a French fortification appeared roughly 100 yards ahead. Beside it stood several fully armed French soldiers who, upon seeing the tanks, instantly raised their hands in surrender. We began to believe that the position could be taken without combat, but one of our tanks fired at the enemy bunker. The garrison immediately vanished inside the concrete shelter. Within moments, the leading tanks came under intense anti-tank fire from the left, while French machine guns swept the entire area. We suffered some casualties, and 2 of our tanks were knocked out. Once the enemy fire lessened, reconnaissance revealed another hidden fortification nearby that had not yet opened fire. Additional defensive works were discovered farther to the rear, and the road from Clairfates to Avesnes was blocked by heavy steel anti-tank obstacles. At the same time, elements of the 25th Panzer Regiment joined the battle west and south of Clairfates, while the artillery intensified its bombardment of various sections of the Maginot defenses. French guns now began shelling Clairfates and Sivry. Shortly afterward, motorcycle troops arrived with the engineer platoon of the 37th Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. Protected by tanks and artillery fire, infantry and engineers pushed into the fortified zone. The engineers then started preparing the demolition of the steel hedgehog obstacles blocking the road. Meanwhile, an assault detachment from the Panzer Engineer Company overran the concrete bunker. The men crawled to the embrasure and threw a 6-pound demolition charge through the firing slit. Even after repeated demands for surrender, the defenders refused to emerge, and another explosive charge was thrown in. Eventually, 1 officer and 35 men were taken prisoner, though shortly afterward, the weakened assault detachment had to withdraw when French machine gun fire erupted from another bunker. Darkness gradually settled over the battlefield and farms burned at several points around Clairfates and farther west. I now issued orders for an immediate penetration of the fortified area and a thrust as deep as possible toward Avesnes. Staff officers and artillery units were informed by radio, giving them only enough time to climb into their command vehicles and move out. Taking position directly behind the leading panzer company, we soon rolled past the shattered roadblocks toward the enemy. As the sappers of the 37th Reconnaissance Battalion destroyed the steel hedgehogs, increasingly fierce fighting erupted against anti-tank guns, and a few field positions clustered around houses 1,000 yards west of Clairfates. Shell after shell exploded near our tanks and infantry around the village. Eventually, the enemy guns were silenced by several rounds fired from a Panzer IV. The road westward now lay open. It was already noon, and for the moment we could not expect darkness to conceal our movements. I had therefore ordered the leading tanks to spread out along roads and verges, firing machine guns and anti-tank weapons at intervals during the advance toward Avesny, in hopes of preventing the French from laying additional mines. The remainder of the Panzer Regiment was instructed to follow closely behind the spearhead and remain prepared to engage targets on either flank. The rest of the division had orders to continue after the Panzer Regiment in motorized columns. The tanks advanced in a long line through the fortifications and toward the first houses that had been ignited by our fire. In the moonlight, we could make out men of the 7th Motorcycle Battalion moving beside us on foot. Occasionally a French machine gun or anti-tank weapon fired, but most shots passed harmlessly overhead. Our artillery maintained heavy harassing fire on villages and roads farther ahead. The pace of the advance steadily increased. Before long, we had penetrated 500, then 1,000, then 2,000 and 3,000 yards into the fortified zone. Engines roared and tracks clattered noisily. In the chaos, it was impossible to tell whether the enemy was still firing. We crossed the railway line about a mile southwest of Salre-le-Château and then swung north onto the main road, which we soon left again for the secondary roads. The civilians in the houses were awakened abruptly by the noise of tanks, gunfire, and engines. Troops lined the roads, military vehicles stood parked in farmyards, and frightened French soldiers huddled in ditches, along hedges, and in every depression beside the road. We passed streams of refugees whose abandoned carts stood beside the roads while their owners fled into the fields. Still, we continued steadily toward our objective. Every so often, I glanced at the map under a shaded light and sent a brief wireless report to divisional headquarters, describing our position and the success of the 25th Panzer Regiment.